Hey everyone, welcome back to our Unreal Engine 5 FPS series. In this video, we're going to finally create a weapon blueprint and add some animations to the player. Let's begin. The first thing I'm going to do is, just to make it really exciting, I'm going to click on the character and I'm finally going to add an animation. We're just going to use this one for testing for now, but even then this is at least going to be a little bit exciting. So I'm going to go here, go to the mesh, and under animation mode, I'm going to change this to use animation asset. And inside of animation asset, I'm just going to pick the idle loop that we made in an earlier video. That will already give us an animation. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, before I even play, is I'm going to go to the content drawer. And this is also going to be just for preview. So I'm going to go to the assault rifle. Under meshes, I'm going to click on the SK assault rifle and I'm going to drag it in. Now, this assault rifle is going to be parented right here. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but just make sure you parent it to the mesh. And then you go to its details panel, and in parent socket, find IK hand gun. That will attach it directly to the character. Now, if we compile and play, we have the assault rifle parented, and we have the animations playing. That said, we do have quite a few issues right now. For instance, the camera is rotating really oddly, or the rifle is not really rotating with us, and then also we have a lot of clipping going on. Let's fix the clipping first because that's the easier part. To fix the clipping, all you need to do is go to Edit, Project Settings, and inside of all settings, you just search for Clip. And this setting, near clip plane, is going to pop up. All you need to do is set this to 0.01. That should fix a lot of the clipping when you restart the engine. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to restart it. And now, as you can see, we have a lot less clipping. I mean, there's basically barely any clipping right now. Great. The next thing we need to fix, and this one's going to be pretty important, we need to put the camera in the right position. How do we do that? Well, first let's open up the character again. So that's going to be core BP character. I already had it open before. And inside here, we don't have a camera, so we can't really change its position. So we're going to need to do a little bit of trickery here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a camera. Now this will pretty much make it so it works exactly the same as the magical floating non-showing up camera that we had before. But it's going to allow us to position it. Where are we going to position this? Well, the place we want to position this camera is under the mesh. Because in the mesh itself, if we look at the skeleton, so if we go to mesh, skeletal mesh asset, and then to the skeleton, you're going to see that we have a head bone. I'm going to search for it, as a matter of fact. There's a head bone, and this bone right here is the bone where we're going to parent the camera. This is where David made it in Blender so that the weapons would look proper if we put the camera here. So we wanted to parent it right there. So I'm going to close this up. And I'm going to go to the camera, and since it's parented right now under the mesh, we can attach to one of the bones on it by just clicking on parent socket and then inside here searching for the bone. So in our case, it's going to be head bone. Now, if the position looks a little bit weird, just make sure you reset the values right here, and then everything should be correct. The one other thing we need to do is actually rotate this correctly. You can see that it has this little weird thing right here, the camera, so we're going to have to put that up. So let's just rotate it. Yep, that's basically it. I'm also going to make the camera a little bit smaller, so I'm just going to make it 0.3. You don't really need to do this, and it won't change anything per se, but it is easier to see everything that's going on in the little viewport here. Now, if I compile and play now, you can see that the weapon is showing up properly, so now we have a proper idle loop playing. The issue we have is if I try to rotate up and down, I'm not really rotating up and down. And that is because we are not, or the rotation we were applying before, which we were applying through the, let's take a look at the character. We were applying camera rotation before through these functions right here. Add controller pitch input and add controller yaw input. In our case, the yaw input still works because the capsule component is still taking the yaw input. But the camera right here isn't really so concerned with anything we're doing with the pitch input. So we're going to need to set it up such that we can rotate the whole thing. And not only do we have to rotate the camera, because if you look at our setup right here, if we rotate the camera, we're going to have the same issue. The weapon isn't going to rotate with it. So we need to figure out a way to rotate everything from the camera's position, because we kind of want everything to rotate with the camera and look exactly the same at all angles. There's a few ways to do this. One of them is with some animation magic. We're not going to do that one. The other way to do it is creating a pivot and placing it at exactly this position and then parenting everything to it. So let's do that slowly. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the capsule. I'm going to go to add and I'm going to search for scene. This is pretty much just as it says there, is a component that has a scene transform and can be attached to other scene components. It's just kind of an empty component. I'm going to call this one pivot. I'm going to drag pivot under camera, and then I'm going to reset all of its values. Actually, you can keep the scale. We don't really care about the scale. And then now that I've already done that, and you can see the pivot is exactly at the camera, I'm going to drag it back out to the capsule component, and it's going to stay there and have the correct values to stay there under capsule component. Now, the next step we would do is drag this mesh under pivot, but we can't because this mesh comes with the character blueprint and we're not really allowed to do anything with it by default. So instead of that, I'm going to go ahead and remove our skeletal mesh from here. So just clear it and not do anything with this mesh right here. We're going to just clear and pretty much clear everything. We don't care about it. Instead of that, under pivot, I'm going to create a new skeletal mesh, and I'm going to call this character, or character arms. And character arms is going to be the one that actually holds the mannequin arms. You're going to see that it looks a little bit tiny, mostly because it's set to 0.3. We want to reset that real quick. So we're going to rotate this back, just as it was before. Rotate it, lower it up. You basically just need to match that with the bottom of the capsule. Then we're gonna take the camera and we're gonna parent that to the character arms. And you do exactly the same thing. So you parent it to the head. Reset this. And then make sure the rotation is correct. That's gonna be minus 90. And then I think minus 90 here. Nope. 90. Okay. Make sure this kind of matches the pivot. If it doesn't, we can fix it in a moment. And then drag the assault rifle to the character arms too. And then also make sure you match this to or you parent this to the handgun and reset. So that would be parented. Just to ensure that everything is working, we can go to the character arms, select use animation asset under animation mode, and pick the idle loop again, just so we can see an animation. And again, if I click on the camera and I click on the pivot, they are slightly different right now, so let's fix that. To fix that, I can drag the character arms to the capsule component, drag the pivot to the camera, reset its position and rotation, drag the pivot back out to the capsule component, and then drag the character arms under the pivot. Now, they should be perfectly matching. I know this seems rather confusing and it might be a little bit complicated initially, but really if you just do that step by step, you're only going to need to do that once. You just need to match the pivot to the camera, basically. Now, if we try to play, nothing has really changed at a practical level. We're still rotating by the same thing, and we still do not rotate up and down. But now we actually have something that we can rotate up and down. So if you look at the pivot, and if I rotate this, you're going to see that everything rotates with it, which is great. This is exactly what we want. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to rotate all of that. Now, how do we do that? Well, that is a really great question. First of all, I'm going to reset this value right here. We don't care about the pivot's rotation. That is exactly what we're going to update, as a matter of fact, so keep that at 0. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the event graph. As you can see, before we were kind of adding to the controller pitch input, whatever that is. Well, it turns out controller pitch input is, or this value that we add to is a value that we can kind of get from, and we can set the pivot's rotation to it. So let me explain that a little bit slower. First, I'm going to go to functions, click on override, and find tick. Now tick is just an event called every frame. So everything that we run here is going to happen every single frame of the game. I'm going to drag this here. If I search for a function called get control rotation, it's going to tell us get the rotation of the controller, often the view rotation of the spawn. Now this is going to return whatever value, in this case a rotator, whatever value comes from us adding rotation every frame of the camera's movement or of the mouse's movement. So this is exactly the value we want because this is our rotation value. So if we take this rotation value and we take our pivot and we call set rotation on it, in our case we can just set relative rotation. If we were to set this to this and then plug it into here, so we do this every frame. By the way, we're doing this every frame just to ensure that we don't have any kind of weird skipping of rotation. If I play now, I can properly rotate. Now, there is a little bit of an issue, and that is the fact that right now we are technically rotating the capsule component left and right, and then we are also rotating the pivot left and right as well, so on our yaw axis. So I would exclude that part by just going to break rotator, right-clicking and pressing split struct pin, and then the only thing I would really plug into here is the pitch, because we only need to rotate this up and down. So if we play now, I can rotate up and down, left and right, everything feels smooth, everything is working properly. Great. Okay, let's do one more thing for this tutorial, just to keep it pretty short and sweet. I'm going to create an animation blueprint, and I'm going to transition between a idle pose and an aim pose, just so we can look at how that would happen. First thing, or the first step to kind of do that is we're going to go to the content drawer. Inside of core, I'm going to right click, go to animation, animation blueprint, and I'm going to click on our skeleton that we're using, in this case, Skell UE5 mannequin, and click create. I'm going to call this ABP character. Now, select ABP character and go back to your character blueprint. Under character arms, instead of setting the animation mode to use animation asset, we're going to set it to use animation blueprint, and then select the animation blueprint we just created. That's not going to do anything, as you can see right now, but we are going to do a lot of things with it in a moment, so let's just ignore that for now. Let's go back to the content drawer and double click on ABP character to open it. Now, it is in here that we can play all the animations we want and do whatever we want in terms of animations. So what do we do first? Well, let's do exactly what we did before. Let's right click, and I'm going to find the idle loop. In fact, if I just search for idle loop, you're going to see that we're going to find a play assault rifle idle loop. So all I'm going to do is just drag that to the output pose and compile. And that will make sure that we're playing exactly the same animation as we were playing before. So you can see there's absolutely no difference, which is great. Now, how are we going to transition from this to an aim loop or an aim pose? Well, let's right click again and search for a aim loop, or aim pose in our case, or actually we'll use the idle loop aimed. If I plug this one in, you're going to see that we're going to run we're going to play the aimed idle loop animation. That's what that looks like. So we need to transition between these two. The way we do that in an animation blueprint, in a very simple way, is we need to use this blend poses by bool node. There's many ways to actually transition, but for now we're going to use this one, which is going to allow us to blend between one pose and another, or full loops in this case, by just checking a boolean, which in our case will be an aiming value that we don't have yet, but we'll create in a moment. So let's plug the idle loop to false, and then the idle loop aimed to true. And then let's connect this right here and compile. Now, since the active value is false, you can see that we're playing the idle loop, but if I click this one and then compile, you can see that it plays the aim loop. So we can now kind of control what is playing. Let's create a value for this. Let's right click on active value, promote to variable, and call it be aiming. And then let's just out of OCD just connect all that. Now, we need to set this value from somewhere in our character, just like we do with, for example, our crouching value, like right here. We need to do that with an aiming value. So the process is going to first entail that we set up an aiming action. So we're going to do exactly the same thing we've done in past tutorials. Go to content drawer, go to data, right click, find input, input action, IA aim. Again, we don't need to change up anything inside of it. Go to IMC FPS, which is our input mapping context. This is pretty much the same if you've seen the last few tutorials. Add an action mapping. Select the aim action that we just created. Select the key value to be right click. And that's it inside of here. We don't need to do anything else. Inside here, we're going to have a new event. That's going to be IA aim. Now, the difference here is that we're only going to create a variable for it and then set it. So that the way we're going to do that is just create a variable by clicking here, call it be aiming. And then whenever we trigger the aiming action, by the way, all I did here is drag and alt click, but you can also just click on set. You can drag the execution pin from the triggered output here to the set aiming and just set that to true. And then whenever we complete the aiming actions, meaning we stopped holding the key, we're going to set it back to false. That's all we're going to do right here. We are done with this. Now, from the animation blueprint, we need to somehow access this aiming value that we have here. By the way, I'm going to make a little comment here just so we can see it easier when we scroll out and compile again. So we need to access that value. How do we access that? Well, it turns out that we immediately, if we go to the event graph instead of the animation graph, this is, by the way, the graph where we do all the animation stuff, and then the event graph is where we can kind of get values and modify values and kind of do any kind of operation we want. Inside of the event graph, by default, we have this blueprint update node event. This event here is just kind of a tick for the animation, so it runs every frame, but it allows us to get values and set values from other places. And the function they give us for that is try get pawn owner. Now this is going to return whatever character or pawn in this case holds this animation blueprint. So for us, that is BP character. So that's perfect. The only issue is that it returns it in this pawn object format. We don't want that. What we want is a BP character so we can access the aiming value. Because from here, if I go aiming, there's absolutely no sort of reference. The engine doesn't know about the aiming value because it connects that to this BP character type, not to the pawn type. So the way to fix that is to simply just drag from it and then type cast and then the name of your class. So cast to BP character. And that will give us a reference of type BP character. So right here, this is the same kind of object that it was pointing to, just as a BP character. So from here, we can drag and say get aiming. And when we get the aiming value, we can assign the value on the animation blueprint to be that aiming value. And that's great because now every frame we are updating our animation blueprint aiming value, which I'm going to rename a little bit just so we don't confuse it. We're updating that value with the character's aiming value, which comes from here. And that's being updated when we right click or when we hold the aiming action. That's exactly what we wanted. And then all of that gets plugged into this kind of blend between the two loops, and it's going to pick a pose. Let's test that. So if I go here and I right click, you see that we can finally control how the aiming looks. Great. Awesome. All right. Well, this is really good. The last thing that I'm going to leave you with is that right now the aiming feels a little bit quick. The way to solve that is if you go back to the animation blueprint, you have this true blend time and false blend time right here. You can also modify them from inside here. These are the values that control how long the blend takes from one animation to the other. So the true blend time is going to control how long a blend from the idle loop to the idle loop aimed is going to take, because that's the true. And then the false one is going to control how long a blend from the aim loop, the true one, to the false one, the idle loop, is going to take. So if we set both of these to something like 0.25, and then compile, you can see that that's a little slower. You can also just set one of them. For instance, you can aim in quicker than you aim out if you wanted that. You can set them to whatever you like. But yeah, we will mess around a lot more with these and do a lot of other cool things in the next tutorial and next tutorials. So I hope to see you in those.